Vintage Auctions recently hosted an error coin showcase auction, and I thought it might be fun to look at some of the more interesting pieces that were on offer. Let's start off with a Lincoln Shield penny from 2015. And while the reverse of the coin shows no abnormalities whatsoever, the Obverse takes the idea of a die crack to a completely different level. Never mind the spiked head varieties of late, but what we see here is the result of a completely split Obverse die, where the Obverse die was cracked completely in half and must have been mere moments away from a complete and catastrophic die failure. PCGS gave this coin a grade of MS65 red, and at auction it sold for the sum of $720. Another rarely seen example for a Lincoln cent error is this 1984 D penny that was struck on a completely uncoated zinc planchet that never received the normal 5% copper plating. This is from an era when the mint had just transitioned from 95% copper coins to the copper-plated zinc core pennies that we still use to this day. So plating errors were not entirely unknown for the 82 to around 84 era. This is an extract from the Weinberg collection that was graded by PCGS as MS66 and at auction sold for $1,560. And just a quick contrast to that was also an example of a partially plated coin from 1995, and again from the Denver Mint, where only around a third or so of the coin received the proper copper plating. This was authenticated by NGC with a grade of MS65 that saw it changing hands at auction for $1,320. Here we see an example of a very unusual type of error coin, known as a saddle strike. This error can happen when a planchet is fed into a dual press incorrectly, where multiple sets of dies are mounted next to each other, landing on the collar dies and in between two sets of dies. The blank is then struck by two sets of dies, causing metal to flow inwards and buckle at the center, somewhat resembling a horse saddle as the final result, hence the name of the error. This is an example of just such an error coin from a 1964 penny graded by PCGS as MS64 red, which sold at auction for $1,560. This rather oddly shaped 1970 dated proof Kennedy half dollar from the San Francisco Mint is a great example of a Broadstruck coin. The reason it is not perfectly round, as in fact it should be, and despite the fact that it was struck slightly off center, is because it is a Broadstruck coin, or struck without the collar die. Without the collar die deploying properly, the metal was able to flow and expand without any restrictions when the blank was struck by the immense force of the coining press. Graded by NGC as proof 65, this brilliant error coin was sold at auction for $2,040. Sometimes a coin may get stuck to the hammer, or even in extremely rare cases, the anvil die after being initially normally struck, when a new planchet is then fed in between the two dies and then struck again, with the first coin still stuck to one of the dies. This is the type of error that then results. With each successive strike, the coin becomes more and more deformed as it is pushed over and around the die that it was initially stuck to, at the same time erasing what details may have been on the reverse, which is repeatedly getting pummeled against the new coin blank. This is an example of what is known as a capped die. Specifically here, an obverse cap of a Jefferson nickel with multiple strikes. Graded by NGC as MS66, when the auctioneer's gavel fell on this lot, it raised $2,640. Another example of a rather spectacular die cap was this 1965 Lincoln cent. Unlike the Jefferson nickel example from before, this one was not split by successive strikes, but rather managed to stay largely intact. Graded as MS65 red from PCGS at auction, it sold for $840. Here we see a 1976S Bicentennial Washington quarter that was struck on an underweight planchet, presumably a wayward 5-cent planchet. Not only that, but a closer look at the coin reveals some absolutely fantastically bold clash marks on both the obverse and the reverse, but it is especially noticeable on the reverse of the coin. This happens when two dies clash or strike each other without a planchet being in between the two, leaving an impression of one on the other. That is why you can make out some of the stars and the flame of the Bicentennial logo, letters of E Pluribus Unum, and the drummer's hand towards the left of Washington's profile, and the drummer's shoulder and the section of his vest again towards the right, as well as similar inverse details of the obverse design that you can see on the reverse of the coin as well. Graded by PCGS as Proof 68 Deep Cameo, this clashed quarter sold at auction for $2,640. And of course, error coins are not the exclusive domain of modern coins by any means. After all, when you are producing anything at scale, even if those things are coins, things can and do go wrong, like it did for this 1890 Seated Liberty dime that was struck about 30% off center. This error, now more than 130 years old, was authenticated by PCGS with a grade of AU55 that saw a closing price at auction of $2,760. Next in line are a couple of very dramatically doubled struck coins. This is obviously a Jefferson nickel, but one that failed to fully eject from the coining press and was then struck a second time as a result. The second strike took place about 50% almost due south relative to the obverse of the coin. The second number 6 of the date is partially obscured by the second strike, but enough details do remain to discern that it was another 6. The reflective fields and the subtle satiny luster on the devices indicate that the coin was meant to be a part of an SMS set or special mint set for that particular year. Graded by NGC as MS64 Cameo, this rare error coin was sold at auction for $3,360. The next example is even more impressive than the last. This is a Kennedy $half coin that was, similar to the prior coin, also double struck. But unlike the previous example, this one was not even struck on the correct planchet to begin with. Instead, the $half was struck on a clad Roosevelt dime planchet, and then somehow even double struck after that. The date for this piece was unfortunately completely off planchet, but since the coin has a proof finish and it is struck on a clad planchet, we can safely assume that the San Francisco Mint was responsible for this error coin. Graded by PCGS from the Fred Weinberg collection as Proof 64, when its turn came on the auction block, it managed to raise $3,840. Our next coin is probably one of the most visually striking type of error coins, that being a bonded pair, where a malfunctioning coin press either failed to properly eject a coin after striking it, or, more likely, struck it improperly the first time, possibly out of color, which then led to the coin getting stuck. Another new planchet is then fed into the coining press while the first one was still there, and then struck once again, which is why the piece is so badly deformed around its edges. This also caused the two planchets to bond together as a single piece, and explains why a large section of the obverse is uniface, or blank essentially. Interestingly, here on the reverse you can clearly see that there were at least 3 separate strikes that took place before the coin was eventually ejected from the coining press. Graded by PCGS as MS65, it sold at auction for the sum of $5,160. Alright, so here we have a very strange mint era coin that simply has no real reason to exist. A double denomination error where a 1996 Lincoln cent was struck over a 1995 Roosevelt dime. Fascinating to see that features of both designs are still clearly seen on the obverse and reverse, including the profiles of both presidents, two very clear dates, and on the reverse, the denominations of 1 cent and 1 dime were actually struck over one another, albeit slightly offset. This means that a dime from 1995, somehow either by accident or by design, it's really impossible to say at this point, made its way into the feed of a press for a 1996 penny. A fascinating coin graded by PCGS as MS65 that sold at auction for $6,600. An intriguing transitional era coin, not entirely dissimilar to the 1943 copper pennies or the 1977 D Ike dollars struck on silver planchets that were to follow in the decade next, is up for discussion next. This is a 1965 Washington quarter that was inadvertently struck on a silver planchet instead of the clad planchets that came into use in that year. You see, as a result of a coinage shortage at the time, the mint continued to strike 1964 dated coins on older silver planchets during 1965, when the mint was supposed to start making coins on clad planchets. This silver planchet then made its way into the coining press along with a lot of clad planchets and was then minted as a 1965 dated coin, something that was never supposed to happen. Graded by PCGS as XF45, it raised $9,300 at auction. Subscribe to WNN and activate notifications with the bell icon so you'll know when new videos are released. For the World Numismatic News, I am Numisman saying thank you for watching, stay safe, keep collecting, and have a fantastic day.